All right, welcome aboard, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Thank you for joining me. I have a special edition this day. Salih Hudayar is my guest. He is the foreign minister of the East Turkistan government. Salih, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
So, before we get into your important mission in the United States representing your government, just talk a little bit about yourself and how you arrived at this particular position.
Sure. I was originally born in East Turkestan, which is the homeland of the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples. It was occupied by Communist China in 1949, in December of 1949.
Mhm.
And in 1955, China renamed it or designated it as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Xinjiang in the Chinese language meaning the new territory or the colony or the new frontier.
I see.
I was born in 1993 in the city of Atush, which is in the southwest corner of East Turkestan, bordering Kyrgyzstan. I grew up in East Turkestan until when I was 7 years old, when we fled to the United States as political refugees. Actually, my father had fled first out of East Turkestan in 1995, following intensified crackdowns on our national movement. Then he made it into the U.S. In 1998. And then, with the help of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, he was able to reunite us with him in June of 2000 is when we arrived in Oklahoma. So I
Mhm.
grew up, much of my life I spent in Oklahoma, where I graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a bachelor's in international studies and a minor in political science. I also previously had been a member of the Oklahoma Army National Guard, and I wanted a military career, so I had done ROTC. But unfortunately, due to a polycystic kidney disease, after like 2 years into my military career, I was, given a medical discharge, unfortunately, and so I studied political international studies and political science. And then when I was finishing it up in 2016, this is when the both the election cycles was happening in the United States, but also at the same time, the Chinese government, which had officially launched its campaign of genocide against our people in May 2014, began to intensify it with the mass internment of pretty much everyone that they deemed was unreliable or disloyal to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state. So many of my relatives back home in East Turkestan, they began to be taken into the concentration camps. In fact, by 2017, I had over 100 relatives that were taken. By the end of 2017, I had over 100 relatives taken into the camps. So in the summer of 2017, I founded the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement, or the national movement, with like-minded Uyghurs, young Uyghurs and Kazakhs that actually grew up here in the United States, and to one advocate for recognition of the genocide, and to get legislative and political action to end the ongoing genocide against our people. And then, as my success in getting the U.S. Congress to introduce a Uyghur Policy Act, or the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, as well as other policy actions, the United States government and others began to speak out and condemn China's atrocities. This made me more recognized in our diaspora. And in 2019, in April, I was initially appointed as the ambassador for the United States, or to the United States, for the East Turkestan government in exile. And
Mhm.
then in June of 2019, during the eighth Parliament in Exile's um, uh, elections, I was elected as one of the representatives of our Parliament in Exile for the United States, for our diaspora community in the United States. And then in November 2019, at the 8th General Assembly, where the Parliament elects our government leadership, I was, despite my unwillingness to be, to take a top level position. The other members of parliament, some nominated me as the prime minister, and out of the three candidates, I got the most votes, and I ended up being the prime minister of the East Turkestan government in exile from 2019 till 2023. During my time as the PM, we extensively engaged advocacy across not just the United States, but in Canada, in Europe, the UK, where we tried to get governments to recognize the genocide. And finally, in October of 2020, the Canadian Parliament initially recognized the genocide, and then I used that recognition to persuade the U.S. Senate, specifically Senator Cornyn's office, to support legislation to recognize the Uyghur genocide, and he did. And shortly after that, I also began to we for years we have been trying to press the State Department to do the same thing. And in the last days of the first Trump administration, Secretary Mike Pompeo designated, in fact, this coming Monday, marks the 5th anniversary of the U.S. officially designating China's atrocities against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic peoples of East Turkestan as genocide. Then we spearheaded a first ever legal complaint against China, the Chinese officials, for genocide and crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court. And we've extensively been trying to get governments to recognize East Turkestan as an occupied country, recognize that the root of our suffering of the ongoing genocide lies in Chinese occupation and colonization, and to support our right to national self-determination, decolonization, and independence. In November of 2023, after the new government was elected by our parliament at the 9th General Assembly, I was appointed by the new government as the foreign minister of the East Turkestan government in exile.
Okay, and I want to give my listeners a little background on East Turkestan, because I think that you have done a great job, and your government in exile, in terms of raising public awareness about it. It's something that you hear young people talk about, and the oppression of the Uyghurs. I don't see people hitting the streets like they did during the so-called Free Palestine movement. And I don't see people, marching on college campuses, which I think is actually pretty interesting. But putting that aside, I want to get into a little bit of the background of East Turkestan, only because I don't know a lot about it. It seems to me to be similar as the Central Asian nation to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and the other Stan nations, all of which were former Soviet, all of which obtained their sovereignty and independence at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. And yet East Turkestan remains captive by China. Now, you say that China occupied, or conquered, I suppose, East Turkestan in 1948 or 1949, around the time that the Communist Revolution was able to, with the aid of certain people in the U.S. State Department, take over China. Before that date, was East Turkestan sovereign? I mean, was it an independent country? I mean, what was going on there in the centuries, in a way, the centuries, or even just the decades before then?
Yes, so East Turkestan historically has been an independent nation. There were periods when we were briefly occupied by other powers. In fact, we have a history of at least over 3,000 years of statehood. We have a history of over 6,000 years of presence in East Turkestan. So the Uyghurs today are a hybrid nation, actually, of the Indo-European and Turkic peoples.
Right.
So that have inhabited East Turkestan and the surrounding regions for the past 6,000 plus more years. In fact, the Indo-European segment of our DNA traces back to the end of the Ice Age, according to newly discovered archaeological and DNA analysis.
Right.
So historically, were independent for a long time. In 1759, the Manchu Qing Empire invaded East Turkestan and occupied it and governed it as a military colony, to where they didn't have like administrative, administration, but they had military governors, and essentially the local chiefs or begs were allowed to retain their power, their autonomy, you could say, in a way. Between 1759 and 1863, we rebelled 42 times against the Qing occupation, and then in 1864 to 1877, the end of 1877, December 1877, we were an independent nation known as the official title was the State of Yetishar. But if you look at historical maps, we were labeled as East Turkestan or the Kingdom of Kashgaria, and that was the issue. However, during the Great Game, which was the great power competition between Russia and the Russian Empire and the British Empire, East Turkestan was caught in the middle, and so both sides, you could say, allowed the Qing Empire to reconquer East Turkestan. So briefly, before I continue, I want to get back into the history of where the term East Turkestan comes from. Because,
Sure.
The Chinese propaganda is that there was never an East Turkestan. This was something that was invented by the CIA or something in recent decades. However, historically, we were known as Turkestan. Since at least the 5th century, we were known as Turkestan, not just East Turkestan, but the collective of Central Asia was known as Turkestan. And Turkestan is you could say it's the Sogdian term for the Turkic Khaganate, which ruled over Central Asia between the 5th to 7th century. Or 8th century, between the 5th to 8th century. And what happened is that when East Turkestan and West Turkestan became distinguished, is starting in the 1720s, the first, after the Russians started, the Russian Empire started slowly invading parts of Turkestan. This is when the Swedish military geographers was the first person to distinguish it, saying that this part of the Pamir Mountains and is West Turkestan, and this part east of the Pamir Mountains is East Turkestan. So this was when the framing of East versus West Turkestan came about. And by the 1800s, it was common, and that was the accepted term. West Turkestan, or the Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, were gradually conquered by the Russian Empire, and East Turkestan, we were conquered by the Qing Empire. And in 1884, the Manchu Qing, after conquering East Turkestan in 1878, December 1877 or early 1878, they renamed East Turkestan to Xinjiang in 1884 and officially incorporated into its empire. And Xinjiang, at the time in the Chinese language, translated literally as the colony. However, the modern translation is the new territory or the new frontier. This is the official translation.
All done with the connivance of the British as part of the big power game. It's obvious that East Turkestan has its own ethnic background. I could tell that just by looking at you. It's not Chinese, and that the Turkestan movement was a very highly national movement, really going back in history, but it was particularly pronounced in the early years of the Soviet Union when, they didn't just walk in and take over Central Asia. There was a huge fight. So it's a whole chapter of history that not a lot is known about, and it should be known about. Maybe you could publish a book about it. But that the result was, as you say, conquest of much of West Turkestan by the Soviet Union, and China asserting it's forcibly asserting its control over East Turkestan. Now, at what point did the situation devolve into what you call a genocide? I mean, and how is it genocidal? Are they trying to wipe out the Turkic people? I mean, what are they doing in terms of the Communist Chinese?
Yeah, so I want to briefly step back to the your second question before getting into the third. So after 1884, we continued to resist the Qing Empire. In fact, we had uprisings in 1905, 1907, 1912, 1915, and then in 1931. And this was the most prominent one because after the uprising in 1931, we were actually able to formalize our independence movement, to where by 1933 of November 12th, we declared independence as the East Turkestan Republic. However, again, the Soviet Union, fearing that we would, become a base for, our brothers in West Turkestan who are resisting against the Soviet Union, they invaded East Turkestan and supported Chinese forces to overthrow our government in April of 1934. Then we had a brief period from 1934 to 1943, which East Turkestan was ruled by a Chinese warlord backed by the Soviet Union. And in 1944, we declared independence again as this East Turkestan Republic, again on November 12th. And this time, the Soviet Union initially supported our republic. Not because we really cared, but against leverage against China to pressure China to recognize Outer Mongolia's independence, and then to get access to our uranium, which they were needed for building their nuclear atomic bombs at the time. And in 1949, in August of 1949, the Soviet Union called our leaders to the Soviet Union for a meeting. So this included all of our top leaders, including our foreign minister, our defense minister, our army chiefs of staff, our interior minister, and other high-level government officials. And then they were essentially coerced to, they were saying that you're going to join China. And when they refused, they were tortured and then executed. And then
I mean, they actually had like a diplomatic meeting, and they called in the government of East Turkestan, and they seized them and killed them.
Yeah, and then they stated this happened in August of 1949. Then they staged a plane crash on August 27th over Siberia, stating that all of our leaders died in a plane crash on their way to Beijing to meet up with Mao. However, the NKVD, or the MGB, which is the predecessor of the KGB, the head of the MGBM, who was responsible for Central Asia at the time, he published a book, I believe in 1995 or 96, years after the Soviet Union fell, called Special Tasks. His name is Pavel Sudoplatov. And in his book, he said, this is where he stated in his book that they were executed because they refused to give up independence, and the plane crash was just staged. So decades after they were killed, this was we finally got the truth. Then Stalin told Mao that you need to invade East Turkestan and occupy it. Mao didn't have an initial plan to occupy East Turkestan, not until 1952 or 53. He first wanted to take over Tibet. But Stalin said, no, if you don't occupy East Turkestan, then the British will get involved, and they will use East Turkestan to pressure both you and me, meaning the Soviet Union. So your first priority needs to be occupying East Turkestan. We'll provide you logistical and other support needed. So on October 12th, 1949, 11 days after the PRC, Mao declared the People's Republic of China. Chinese Communist troops invaded East Turkestan, and then Stalin also began airlifting Chinese troops into East Turkestan. And then on December 22nd, 1949, after they had occupied virtually every part of East Turkestan, they overthrew the independent East Turkestan Republic. So this is that. Now coming back to your third question about when, what is happening? Is it really a genocide? So what China is doing is not just something that just randomly happened. In fact, this has been going on for decades. In fact, their official campaign of genocide started on May 23rd, 2014, and China calls it a so-called "Strike Hard" campaign. That's the official term for it.
At that time, was there agitation in East Turkestan for independence? Is there like a military movement there? Is there an underground movement?
We had always resisted in ways that were possible through mass demonstrations, protests, civil disobedience. In fact, even our leaders in 1955, they rejected the fake autonomy that China gave us. And China at that time began to label them as so-called local nationalists and essentially, wiped out our entire leadership of that era. Then in the 60s, this is the term that they used from the 1950s all the way till the late 70s, they called it local nationalism or counter-revolutionary activities. And then starting in the 90s, they began to call it, separatism. And then after 9/11 is when they began, because the majority of our people are Muslims, they began to say that we are, terrorists. This is the term that they began to use.
And by the way, let's be clear: the Turkestan and the Central Asian republics, they're Muslim, but there's a long tradition of very moderate approach to Islam. It's not in any way connected to, Al Qaeda or anything like that. So
exactly. We actually follow the Hanafi school of thought, which is the most liberal form of a school of thought in Islam, from the Sunni sect.
There's also religious tolerance, because I think that Turkestan was really the main thoroughfare of the Silk Road in medieval times, and you had all the great trade go between China and Europe, and this is where Marco Polo traveled, and it's still an incredible thing to be on. I mean, I'm following somebody on social media, this young American who goes on the Silk Road, and he says it's amazing. I mean, like you're American. Suddenly he's all these great dinners, and everyone's inviting him and come in, And it's an incredible country, and it has a great history of peaceful existence and trade and traditionalism. I think you note accurately that the big powers, and then that picked up eventually by the Soviet Union and China, are engaging in a divide and conquer strategy. They want to split the country up into smaller pieces that can be managed. And yet, as we've noted, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, amazingly, Central Asia was able to obtain its freedom, and it's done very well. It's like we have very good, solid, peaceful republics developing there on lines that are enjoying all the blessings of sovereignty. But East Turkestan remains under the jackboot of the CCP, unfortunately.
Yes.
So talk a little more about the genocide, because it sounds like something that it's classic Soviet style, communist style, destruction of its, the enemies of the people, as they like to call it.
Yeah, and in fact, the other euphemism they used, other than calling it a strike hard campaign, they call it the People's War. That's what they call it. Yeah. In fact, fun fact about Uyghurs, we're probably the only nation on earth that embraced every major religion throughout history. So we historically were shamans, Zoroastrians, Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, and then starting from the 10th century and gradually until like the late 1800s, Islam became, by the late 1700s, Islam became the most dominant religion in East Turkestan. But we still have small minorities amongst our religious minorities, amongst our people.
Mhm.
So at the time of China's invasion of East Turkestan in December, occupation of East Turkestan in December 1949, the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples made up over 95% of the population. The Chinese less than 2 to 3%, and that 2 to 3% was the 200,000 Chinese troops and about 100,000 Chinese civil servants and their families that were sent to East Turkestan.
Right.
By 1970s, the Chinese grew over 30%. And then as of 2020, if we take the actual Chinese government's claims, they often downplay our numbers. So we don't truly believe their census. But if we take it for what it is, they claim that the Turkic people's population, the native population, has dropped from 95% in 1949 to about 57, 58% as of 2020.
Okay.
Whereas the Chinese colonist population has grown from 2 to 3% in 1949 to over 40% as of 2020. So it's both a colonialism and genocide. And the genocide, as I mentioned, started in 2014, but they had planned for it years ahead, actually. In 2009, China's top Chinese strategist, who named Dai Shu, who later became the head of China's, later became a general and became the head of China's National Defense University. He held a 2-hour seminar on the future war between China and the United States over Taiwan, which he predicted was going to happen around 2030. That's what he stated in his lecture at the seminar.
Right.
And he highlighted what is the biggest problem that we have right now. What is preventing China from taking Taiwan? He said, we have the military capabilities, we have the financial capabilities, but there is one thing that is preventing us from doing so. What is that? And everybody, the audience is senior Chinese military officers, intelligence officials, etc. And they all, say different things.
Mhm.
And he said, no, you're all wrong. It's because of East Turkestan, the East Turkestan problem. This is what it is. And he said, if we were to launch an invasion of Taiwan, the United States could easily arm 300,000 to 500,000 Uyghurs overnight and cut off our west to east energy pipelines and energy grids. So if you know anything about the Belt and Road Initiative,
Yes.
the BRI, which China launched under Xi Jinping in 2013, it runs through East Turkestan. Without East Turkestan, there is no Belt and Road Initiative. We are the only land connection that China has to South Asia, Central Asia, and ultimately, to Europe and the Middle East. So East Turkestan is strategically vital. All
Right.
of its land-based trade, over 80% of its land-based trade goes through East Turkestan. All of their oil imports from Central Asia goes through East Turkestan. Their natural gas imports goes through East Turkestan.
So
Furthermore,
and plus,
furthermore,
East Turkestan itself has mineral resources.
and
Like uranium. I mean, they don't want to let go of it.
Yeah, and furthermore, East Turkestan is 1,828,418 square kilometers, or roughly
Huge.
2.5 times the size of the state of Texas. So
Oh,
it's huge.
Yeah.
It's about a fifth of the present territories under the PRC's control. So it's huge, but it also is a energy resource base for China. So 40% of their coal of China's of the coal reserves under China's control is in East Turkestan. Over 30% of the oil and natural gas that China claims that it comes from East Turkestan. We also have, a lot of critical minerals, uranium, gold, lithium, green energy. All of that goes, China uses East Turkestan as a power base.
Very wealthy country in terms of like what's under your feet. There's enormous resource there. And I get the fact that China doesn't want to let it go, but I think that what you're saying then is that maybe starting under Xi Jinping, they have ramped up a program of trying to break the back of Turkistan's ethnic identity. It's what they call nationalist movements, and they're doing so with a pretty heavy fist. So, what actually is going on now on the ground in East Turkestan at the hands of the Communist Chinese?
So since 2014, and this is according to China's own 2020 white paper that they launched, defending its concentration camps as so-called vocational training centers or schools. Since 2014, they sent 1.29 million people every single year, or roughly 8 million people over the course of until the end of 2019. And then they further stated that they provided job opportunities for 3.5 million of our people, essentially using us as forced labor or slave labor. So that's one part. And according to China's own judicial, these are the ones that are being, arbitrarily.
Slave labor, I want to clarify. So are they literally setting up concentration camps and separating families and putting people, like maybe the men in one camp and the women in the other, kind of thing, and putting people to slave work?
Yes, they've built over 1,400 camps across East Turkestan. They put people in these concentration camps. First, the reason that they claimed initially, they're like, oh, we're de-radicalizing these people. We are modernizing them. We are, giving them Chinese language training. We're integrating them into the Chinese nation. This was the terms that the Chinese government, the official terms that they used on the outside surface. But in 2019, over 4,000 pages of Chinese government internal documents revealed the true reality, in which Xi Jinping ordered to round up those who need to be rounded up, to uproot them from their roots, to show absolutely no mercy, and to kill those that resist. And so this is what's been happening. Furthermore, over 1 million of our children, and again, the Chinese government states that they are raising or bringing our children, instilling patriotism and loyalty to the Chinese state and Communist Party among our children. This is the official term in boarding schools. But if you look at the so-called boarding schools, whether it's from the outside or the satellite imagery, it's essentially miniature internment camps for children. Over 1 million of our children remain interned in these facilities.
Now, when you say interned, have they been taken away from the parents and they're literally being brought up like
they're stripped from their parents and they're taken away into these internment facilities where they are instructed by Chinese military officers and Chinese military personnel dressed up in miniature Chinese military uniforms and vowing, they can't speak their language. They can't, if they speak our language, they're punished. They are beaten. In many cases, there's been videos that have been leaked of them being beaten by their instructors.
Right, and worse.
They're dressed in, Chinese clothing, Chinese uniforms, and swearing to become, the defenders of the Chinese motherland against China's enemies, etc. These are the type of propaganda that the Chinese government regularly puts out there. We're modernizing them, we're civilizing them. It's typical colonial.
And even their official propaganda is horrible. I mean, why would they're saying, oh, we're doing a great thing by stripping a people of their own identity and their language and religion, which is but of course the reality is even worse than that. I mean, it sounds like a country that's been almost completely enslaved. Now,
it's we are pretty much enslaved. I mean, in addition to that, the Chinese government, they have been trying to suppress the growth of our population. So since, again, this is the Chinese government,
abortions and that kind of thing.
Yeah, this is their own data. This is not us claiming.
No, they've done it before. I mean, look, they had one.
Their state media.
State
media reported in 2009 reported that between 1989 to 2009, they had prevented 3.7 million so-called illegal births amongst the native populations of East Turkestan.
Yeah.
Then further beyond 2009, we estimate at the very least hundreds of thousands have been forcibly aborted as well, because the Chinese government in 2014, as part of this campaign of genocide, they rolled out forced sterilizations of Uyghur women, to where, according to their own data, over 360,000 or 300,000 plus women have been forcibly sterilized. And they put up a 0% growth rate in parts of East Turkestan, saying this is the quota. There should be no growth rates amongst these people. At the same time, they bring in Chinese colonists and allow the Chinese colonists to have as many children as they want, and in fact, give them incentives to do so, such as free land, free housing, free education, cash supplements every month, and so forth. In addition to that, the Chinese government, to hide its atrocities, remember, we are a predominantly Muslim population. So when our deceased die, we bury them. But the Chinese government began building crematoriums across East Turkestan, or so-called burial management facilities. In fact, they've bulldozed not only the living, but also the cemeteries. Many of our cemeteries have been bulldozed. The remains of our ancestors have been, cremated as well, essentially to wipe out any evidence that we existed here as a people. So they built. People are dying in the camps. This is a fact. Organ harvesting, or organ transplants, as the Chinese government calls it. In 2013, they recorded about 6,000 organ transplants.
That's a problem, I think, across China, in that you have some, wealthy, I don't know, sheikh or something, or an American even, needing to have a liver or a kidney, and the Chinese send it to them on the black market.
Yeah,
and
it's not exactly a black market anymore. That's the problem. So in 2013, it was 6,000. By 2014, it skyrocketed to over 50,000. And where is these organs coming from? From our people. In fact, just earlier this year in February, the Chinese government's health ministry stated that they're going to triple the number of organ transplant centers across East Turkestan by 2030.
And this is done while someone's alive, and they basically they're killed, and then they take out the organs.
Yeah, there are special lanes in East Turkestan in airports that say for organ transplants only. Researchers like Ethan Gutman and others who have done extensive research on China's organ harvesting industry, they estimate that their conservative estimate is that between 25,000 to 50,000 Uyghurs starting in 2014 have been killed solely for their organs. This is a horrific number in terms of that. So they're engaging in all acts of the genocide as defined under the UN Genocide Convention.
Right.
So
now, Salih, to sort of like look at another angle here, is there any kind of possibility that there can be a compromise with the Communist Chinese? Because I get the fact that they're not going to let go of East Turkestan. It's too vital for their national interest. So can there be some kind of a modus operandi by which East Turkestan can have autonomy and have like local and regional control, maybe with leaving Communist China in control of foreign policy and military matters?
We've already tried that numerous times. In fact, in 1944, when we declared independence, in 1946, we were then fighting against the Republic of China, or the Nationalist Chinese. Yeah. They're like, oh, let's come to an agreement, and we were like, okay. Well, our leaders then agreed. They're like, okay, you have all control over foreign affairs, over defense of the borders, but we will have legitimate autonomy. We will be able to speak our language. You're gonna stop sending Chinese colonists here. You're gonna withdraw your troops. In fact, our troops will wear your uniforms as well. We'll
Right.
still be under the ROC, but internally we manage our own, and preserve our culture, our language, our religion, etc.
Right.
Then the Chinese, we signed an agreement with them foolishly, and we were like, okay, let's implement this. And the Chinese, instead of implementing it, the nationalist Chinese, what they did is they upped the number of Chinese troops in East Turkestan by over 70,000. It was 40,000, then they brought 70,000 more. Then they began to suppress us. We were going to have free elections. They suppressed that. So our government at the time in 1947, they're like, no. Even we went to, our leaders went to, at that time, Nanjing, to attend, China's National General Assembly, where they were going to draft a new constitution. And we specifically stated, we want you to write in the constitution that we have autonomy. Just like how you're willing to give Mongolians and Tibetans autonomy, we want that written in the constitution that we have, that you will give that. And they refused. And so they're like, all right, this is a sham. You're still doing this. So we're like, no, this peace deal is not going to work out. And so we reasserted our independence. In 1955, as I mentioned earlier, they gave us, fake autonomy as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And immediately after that, what did they begin to do? They began to bring, millions of Chinese colonists using the guise of autonomy, using the guise that we're going to help develop you, modernize you. In fact, the East Turkestan Republic was much more modernized because of our ties to, the Soviet Union, to British India. We were much more better off, both politically, financially, economically, than China itself.
Right.
If you look at the images and the uniforms, of the Chinese invading army, and compare it to ours looked like, our uniform was based off of, the Soviet Union's uniform. So, our weaponry, our system was much more better. We had
threatening.
Yeah, we had rights for our women. Our women had the right to vote. We had women in our government, stuff that the Chinese could never, imagine of at that time. So we were much more modernized and advanced than then. But this is the framework that they used. Then this so-called autonomy has brought us nothing but Chinese colonization and, essentially leading to the genocide, because the goal ultimately is to completely wipe us out as a people. That was clear from the beginning. But because the Chinese were a small minority at that time, and China was weak, they didn't dare push that. So they gave the pacifier of autonomy to us, as a way of tricking us and saying, but over the years, the more the Chinese colonists got bigger, the more they kept killing off our leaders, our intellectuals, the more it was easier for them to carry out this genocide. By 2014, nobody could, stand up to China. No country was going to stand up to China. So this was a green light for them. And so even right now, for example, next Monday January 19th marks the 5th anniversary of the U.S. officially recognizing China's atrocities against our people as genocide and crimes against humanity. Over a dozen Western parliaments issued similar designations. 51 UN member states condemned China at the UN for crimes against humanity. Even the UN Human Rights Commissioner stated that China is, at the very least, engaging in crimes against humanity, but there has been no accountability whatsoever. China has not been punished. In fact, nobody is really doing anything other than, issuing blank statements, saying we're concerned, we're this. There's no meaningful action.
A lot of rhetoric, a lot of hot air.
Yeah.
I think
there's no way we can, come to a compromise with a genocidal colonial regime that wants to permanently erase us.
Now, I've interviewed Chinese dissidents in China, or who are no longer in China, and they report to me that there's a growing dissident movement in China itself. particularly people becoming Christian, both Catholic and Protestant, and it's a huge growing movement in China, and that China one day will wake up like the Roman Empire woke up and find that everybody's become Christian and throw in the towel. Now, I don't know if that'll happen. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I guess my question to you, Salih, is that has your government in exile allied itself with internal Chinese dissent and worked with them? I mean, maybe there's also a dissident movement associated with Hong Kong.
I mean, we've aligned with the Hong Kong movement as best as we can, but as far as China's own internal dissidence movements, whether they're those claiming to be Christian or there's those claiming to be a democracy movement, just look at their response when it came to what China was doing to East Turkestan. They justified it. In fact, many of them defended it and stating that Uyghurs are terrorists. This is a historically Chinese land. This is good. In fact, a Chinese intellectual, a very liberal intellectual, he wrote a book in 2007. He published a book in 2000 called "Your East Turkestan, My West China." This is in Chinese, and he highlighted the problem between the conflict between these two nations. And he said, what China is doing is colonialism. Like, we can spin it off as whatever we want to do, but this is the fact.
In the worst example of it, they're literally replacing or trying to replace an entire population.
He said this is a fact.
Yeah.
But we need to recognize this fact, and we need to at least honor the autonomy we gave them. But he said, when I tried to raise this with the most liberal of leaders in China and intellectuals, he said when he raised the East Turkestan issue with them, he said the words "kill, kill, kill." It's in his book. He said the words "kill, kill, kill" foamed from their mouths, and he said that's when I realized that if it's going to take a genocide, this is what he said. If it's going to take a genocide, if millions of Uyghurs have to be killed to keep this territory under China, even the most liberal of these people won't utter a word against it, and that's the reality. For example, in Canada, when the Canadian Parliament recognized the genocide against our people, there was a Chinese descent senator in Canada. He wasn't even born in China. This guy was not even born in China. I think he was from Singapore or somewhere. But instead of going with the approving the determination of the parliament and recognition, he viciously opposed it, and he said, "You're slandering China. China is not doing that. This is not a genocide. This is going to hurt our relations with China. This is the loyalty." Even in France, the same thing. When the French Parliament voted to recognize the genocide, the one person to oppose it was that Chinese senator as well. He was a Chinese senator as well in the French Parliament. He opposed it. In Netherlands, when the Dutch Parliament recognized the genocide, you had 56 Chinese organizations, including ones that are pro-democracy, pro-whatever, who condemned the French Parliament for recognizing the genocide. Even here in Washington, D.C., there's the guy called Wei Jingshen. He's the leader of the Chinese democracy movement, or that's what that's what the world knows him as.
Right.
And when it came to our genocide, he denied it. He said, no, there's no genocide happening to them. They claim that this is their land, but it's historically part of China. These people were a bunch of barbarians, and we, the Chinese, came and civilized them. This is the reality of Chinese, mentality. So even if China were to become a Christian nation, a democracy, etc., they would just change hats, but their position on East Turkestan remains the same. And, I tried meeting with them, and I said, let's try to work together.
It's very implacable. What about, because we're reaching toward the end of the show here, but what about the Central Asian republics? What about Turkey? Have they taken a position? Are they being? Have they formed any sign of allying with you? Or
No,
Or
no. Turkey, for example, since 1996 or even further, since the 1970s, has aligned with China against us. In fact, Turkey acts as a silver velvet glove or a velvet glove for the Chinese hand in controlling our diaspora and undermining our independence movement. Turkey, despite
whatever happened
being,
to the greater Turkish movement? I mean,
it's
that's out there.
no,
Doesn't
it's all for propaganda to to appease the people. The
okay.
people, the Turkish people, they support us, no doubt, but the government itself, they are against us. For example, Turkey has the Kurdish problem, so they don't want to support our cause because they feel that China would back the Kurds. Furthermore, Turkey needs access to technology, investments, and who's willing to give that? China. In exchange, China's like, you're going to help me undermine this movement, you're going to suppress it. This is why, even though opposition parties in Turkey repeatedly, all the opposition parties came together and repeatedly tried to get a motion recognizing the genocide, the Turkish government refused. The ruling party refused, and so that's been the official position. Central Asian governments, the same thing. They're all heavily corrupted and reliant on China, economically, politically, um, and so they've been doing the same thing. Even though, for example, Kazakhstan, there in East Turkestan, we have over 3 to 5 million Kazakhs. They are facing genocide too, but the
Right.
Kazakh government is turning a blind eye to it. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, the same thing.
Where do you turn then? I mean, to wrap things up, I mean, you've got this powerful hegemonic empire known as China that just it's like a gigantic uh, blob in the middle of the world. It doesn't move or it doesn't. It's intractable. What can you do? I mean, where are you making progress? I mean, in terms of reaching people. I mean, it's you've got an important humanitarian cause, you've got a nationalist cause, you've got all of the basic elements of a right to sovereignty that exist. So, where diplomatically, you being the foreign minister, who are you reaching, and what are you trying to do?
Well, we've been reaching out to mostly the Western countries, the countries that have actually, you know, one, upheld their obligations or tried to uphold their obligations at the very least, even if symbolically.
Mm,
Um, right now, there's a great power competition between the United States and China,
yes,
and it's getting into a position where it might veer into a actual, confrontation.
I
And
hope not.
this is where East Turkestan is vital, both for the United States and other its allies in
Right.
countering China and the BRI, but also this is where our opportunity lies to where we can reassert our independence and uh, ensure the survival of our people. Because without having our own independent state, without having political rights, our human rights is just on paper. No one is coming to defend it. America is not gonna give us, pressure China or make China give us our human rights. China, which is oppressing its own people, is not going to give us their human rights.
So
So the only
your
way for us,
entire wagon is hitched on the possibility of a weakening of China, which could happen organically or it could happen um, in terms of world action. I don't know, but it actually there is evidence that it may be happening. I mean, in terms of now China's had the oil supply cut off from Venezuela, which was a major supply, and they just had a delegation right there advising Maduro just before he was grabbed by the Trump administration. So, the reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere could damage China, and maybe they hopefully will implode on their own, like the Soviet Union did, on their own contradictions, which would give give Turkestan, East Turkestan, an opening at least. So,
yes, and
anyway,
that's what.
Tony, let my listeners and my viewers know how they can get involved, how they can reach you, where they should go.
They can visit our website, east-turkestan.net, or follow us on social media at etexile.gov. And there, if you visit our website, we have volunteer opportunities as well as internships for young people who would like to intern with our movement, and a lot of opportunities to engage, whether it's on the research side, whether it's on the legislative side. We regularly engage with Congress, and other agencies, as well as European Parliament, other parliaments across the world. So there's a lot of things that can be done. At the very least, spreading awareness, learning more about East Turkestan, learning more about the threat that China poses, not just to East Turkestan, but to the United States, to the world as a whole. Because what China is doing in East Turkestan is actually a stage for what they will do if they become the world's dominant power, and that's something that Xi Jinping is aiming for.
Indeed. Okay. Well, Salih, I just wish you Godspeed, and I wish your movement Godspeed. And let's stay in touch. Let me know if there's anything I can do. And I just want to thank you very much for joining me today.